From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now! We're broadcasting from Chicago, outside the NATO summit.
My name is Scott Olson. I'm with me today. Today I have with me my Global War on Terror Medal, Operation Iraqi Freedom Medal, National Defense Medal, and Marine Corps Good Conduct Medal. These medals, once upon a time, made me feel good about what I was doing. They made me feel like I was doing the right thing. And I came back to reality, and I don't want these anymore.
Saying no to NATO. More than 40 veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars hurled their medals Sunday toward the gate of the NATO summit in Chicago. Among them, Scott Olson. He survived 2 tours in Iraq, but almost died when he was hit with a police projectile at an Occupy Oakland protest. We'll also hear voices from the streets of the NATO protests, including musician and activist Tom Morello and civil rights leader Jesse Jackson.
We ventured into Iraq on the wrong target. $3 trillion in lives and money lost. What could $1 trillion do today? Why about every state budget deficit? The 750,000 public workers lost could get their jobs back. So the misadventure is very costly.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Dozens of people have been killed in a suicide bombing in the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. Early reports say around 100 have died, but the death toll could rise. The bomber was reportedly dressed in a military uniform and targeted a military parade. Al-Qaeda has claimed responsibility for the attack. Thousands of people marched in Chicago on Sunday in the largest demonstration so far against the NATO summit. The Chicago police have been criticized by activist groups for using violent force to break up protests. On Saturday, a police van was videotaped nearly running over a protester. Dozens of protesters have been arrested over the past 2 days. The Chicago police have also been accused of targeting independent media activists who've been streaming the protests live over the internet. On Saturday night, police detained 3 live streamers at gunpoint. At the end of Sunday's march, Iraq Veterans Against the War held a ceremony where nearly 50 veterans discarded their war medals by hurling them in the direction of the NATO summit.
That these medals were given to them in many instances for creating essentially unforgivable acts, inflicting pain on innocent civilians in most cases.
This is just to demonstrate that the current operations are not working. I came to a conclusion that there is no such thing as war on terrorism. What we're doing is waging war against the people of Afghanistan, which are resulting into joining the Taliban.
Before the weekend began, 3 activists were arrested on terrorism charges for an alleged plot to attack President Obama's campaign headquarters and other sites around Chicago during the NATO summit. Jared Chase, Brent Betterly, and Brian Jacob Church are accused of conspiracy to commit terrorism, material support for terrorism, and possession of explosives. Police say they recovered materials for making Molotov cocktails in a raid last week. But attorneys for the so-called NATO 3 say they were set up by government informants who planted the explosives. Supporters also say police seized equipment that was used for brewing homemade beer. Michael Deutsch, an attorney for the protesters with the National Lawyers Guild, accused Chicago police of entrapment.
Obviously, we don't have access to all the information that the state has, but what we do know is that there were undercover police officers that ingratiated themselves with people who come from out of town, and from our information, the so-called incendiary devices and the plans to attack police stations, attack the mayor's office, is all coming from the mind of the police informants and are not coming from our clients who are nonviolent protesters. They're not anarchists. They don't belong to a black bloc organization. They're involved with nonviolent protests. And what we believe is that this is a way to stir up prejudice against the people who are exercising their First Amendment rights.
On Sunday, 2 more activists were charged with terror-related allegations, one with threatening to blow up a downtown bridge and a second with seeking to build pipe bombs. Police say the alleged plots were in the planning stages and no explosives were recovered. After headlines, we'll go to the streets of the NATO summit to hear more of the protests. In other news from the Chicago summit, NATO leaders have approved the first phase of a U.S.-led so-called missile defense shield to be deployed in Europe. The plan will deploy a U.S. warship armed with interceptors in the Mediterranean, as well as a radar system in a German base. Russia has condemned the move and threatened to station rockets in areas bordering the European Union. The UN's top nuclear oversight official has arrived in Tehran for talks with the Iranian government. The visit from International Atomic Energy Agency Chief Yukiya Amano comes ahead of a key summit in Baghdad between Iran and world powers, including the U.S., later this week. Ahead of his visit, Amano said he's optimistic that a new framework for monitoring Iran's nuclear sites can be reached.
We need to keep up the momentum. There has been good progress during the recent round of discussions between Iran and IAEA. So I thought that now is the right time for me to visit Tehran and have a direct talk with high-level officials of Iran.
The Republican-controlled House has approved a new military policy bill that would increase spending limits for the Pentagon while upholding indefinite detention. Under the National Defense Authorization Act for the upcoming fiscal year, the U.S. would allocate $642 billion for the Pentagon, exceeding congressionally mandated spending limits by $8 billion. The New York Times notes the bill, quote, makes clear House Republicans and many Democrats are opposed to including the Pentagon in the coming era of fiscal austerity. In approving the measure, lawmakers also reject an amendment that would have barred the indefinite detention of suspects seized on U.S. soil. Alabama Governor Robert Bentley has signed into law a harsher version of the state's notorious anti-immigrant law, despite publicly calling for its revision. The measure would preserve original provisions, including the requirement that schools check enrolling students' immigration status, while adding new regulations mandating the publication of the names and photographs of undocumented immigrants who appear in court. Governor Bentley signed the new measure into law on Friday, just one day after he called for a special legislative session to make changes. The board of directors of the NAACP has voted for the first time to endorse same-sex marriage. The move follows President Obama's endorsement of gay marriage earlier this month and speculation over whether that would hurt his standing among some African-American voters. In a statement, NAACP President Ben Jealous said, quote, civil marriage is a civil right and a matter of civil law. The well-funded right-wing organizations who are attempting to split our communities are no friend to civil rights, and they will not succeed, he said. And tens of thousands took to the streets in the Canadian province of Quebec over the weekend to protest the provincial government's latest efforts to end a 3-month student strike. On Friday, Quebec lawmakers passed an emergency law requiring demonstrators to inform police of any protest route involving 50 or more people. The measure also bars the wearing of masks at protests. Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.